Welcome to the DIA Global Annual Meeting Virtual Edition Pharma Voice Editors Take video series. In this episode, Taryn Grome, Editor-in-Chief of Pharma Voice magazine, meets with Chris Benko, CEO, Koneksa.
Chris, welcome to the Editors Take video program. Thank you for letting us join you in your virtual office.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Chris, let's talk about the regulatory landscape and how would you describe the current regulatory climate re digital biomarkers? It's a hot topic.
It is, and I think we've been fortunate, particularly with the US FDA, that they've actually been quite proactive in promoting approaches to enable the use of digital biomarkers in drug development, specifically through many of the public-private partnerships like the Foundations for the National Institutes of Health, the National Academies of Science and Medicine, and through societies like the Digital Medicine Society, where I'm fortunate to play a leadership role alongside colleagues from the public sector. They're highly engaged with seeking input for how digital biomarkers can be used most effectively in drug development, to the point that I would actually say, many of the frameworks that have been available for developing traditional biomarkers are being rapidly adapted, and appropriately so, toward how to take advantage of these new technologies. The FDA always has a strong bent toward making sure that technologies or new biomarkers are patient-focused or patient-centric. That is to say that they either take into account measures that are particularly meaningful to patients or allow their participation or engagement in a clinical trial to be more convenient or more seamless. And those are important voices. I would actually say, in the contrast to that, 80% of the barrier to adoption to these technologies is actually the conservatism that's inherent with a lot of the large pharma sponsors, who are oftentimes reluctant to propose things that feel novel or scary to them and have a tendency to regress to more traditional approaches, and I think often err on the sides of overcomplicating or overwhelming the FDA, who typically have a lot less resources to deal with some of these decisions versus the tendency of pharma to kind of bury things in complexity and paperwork. So fundamentally, I think the FDA in particular, but also the EMA have been incredibly helpful in promoting the adoption of these technologies to help patients or help the prospects for drug development.
Excellent points. Chris, can you share with us a recent therapeutic use case of a digital biomarker that illustrates what the possibilities hold?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about oncology, because it's an area that people don't think of as nearly as obvious as an application for digital biomarkers as, let's say, movement disorders and things, which might feel more familiar in terms of the advantages. So there are two things that I can tie together here in oncology. One of the things that we've worked on with Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx and presented at ASCO Quality Forum in September of 2019 was the use of a digital biomarker that was based on particular activity patterns in patients to actually serve as a very powerful dynamic predictor of imminent hospitalization in patients undergoing a variety of treatment types, chemo and radiotherapy and pharmacotherapy across a number of different tumor types. And what we found is that it's an incredibly important enhancement that is more predictive than any other traditional variable, and really helps break down some of the communication barriers that often exist, particularly in diverse patient populations, between physicians and their patients. In other words, what we can see from changes in their activity levels under certain circumstances is actually more likely to show that a patient is going to be hospitalized than asking that patient how he or she feels, or other traditional observations like tumor type, tumor stage and location, or quality of life. With Takeda, we also published work at ASH. Takeda published work at ASH in late 2019, looking at the potential for digital biomarkers to differentiate long-term therapies, such as their programs in multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer that people struggle with and are treated for over the course of a number of years. And while scientifically it's been exciting to see many targeted therapies rapidly advancing into the field, I think it's important that we not overlook that oftentimes those therapies advance on the basis of traditional biomarkers that aren't necessarily obvious to the patients or don't reflect how they're feeling. So it's great to come up with a marker that you can measure via fluid or imaging that helps us understand if a drug's going to work. But digital technologies that have the potential to measure people in their real world lives and understand the impact of that therapy, how it's making you feel, how it's changing the way you live your life, are incredibly important. And we're proud to be partnering with companies that are looking at that and really investing in understanding how these therapies will be meaningfully different from one another for patients.
Chris, as a follow-up, is there an optimal time in which to employ a digital biomarker during a clinical trial?
That's a great question, and it really is about the life cycle of a product. So I would say not even so much the trial, but the whole program. One of the challenges, be it with digital or traditional biomarkers, is that they require validation evidence in the population of interest. And so it's difficult to decide that you're going to deploy a digital biomarker to inform anything meaningful in, let's say, a phase 3 study if you haven't done work or if there isn't an existing body of literature that validates how that digital biomarker best characterizes the patient population of interest. So the sponsors that we've seen be most successful think about their digital biomarker development as part of sort of the full life cycle and suite of developing a program. And they tend to start early in phase 1 or doing natural history studies or other kinds of validation work. So they're very confident in the utility of that measure by the time they deploy it to help them make a go, no go decision or to help influence a dialogue with regulators or payers.
And finally, can you guesstimate the number of clinical trials or clinical programs that are right now using digital biomarkers?
You know, it's a great question. I would say it's thousands. I'd have to look at the Digital Medicine Society statistics. They've done a pretty good job of trying to mine public information, but it is somewhat challenging to distinguish what one might consider to be a digital biomarker or not via publicly available information. I think most of our sponsors do a good job of posting what they're doing on clinicaltrials.gov. But for example, when you see that somebody is using spirometry as an endpoint, and you might not necessarily get an indication that the measures are being taken at home via a Bluetooth spirometer twice a day, which is a great example of a digital application or a digital biomarker, versus they're coming into the clinic and providing that reading. Or if they're providing it at home, again, how much of it is digitally enabled versus not. And so a lot of that is hard to tease out. And I think probably if we were to look at what we assess from clinicaltrials.gov or other publicly available sources, we're undercounting the number of digital applications because those documents and those forms don't necessarily provide an obvious way to call out something that's really novel or digital.
Thank you so much for sharing this great knowledge around the possibility and the potential of digital biomarkers as part of clinical trials. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
For more information about Koneksa, visit www.koneksahealth.com.